The unexpected encounter. 9 languages, the boy said with a spark in his eyes, his voice full of pride and determination. It was a scorching afternoon in a bustling African city. The sun blazed mercilessly on the cracked pavements. Vendors shouted over one another selling fruits and handmade goods, and the streets buzzed with the honking of taxis and the chatter of busy pedestrians. In the middle of this chaos, a sleek, shiny black car slowly rolled to a stop. Out stepped a man who immediately caught everyone's attention. His name was Richard, a wealthy businessman, a self-made millionaire, and someone who was used to being noticed wherever he went. His shoes gleamed, his watch sparkled under the sun, and his suit was tailored to perfection. People on the street turned to look at him, some admiring, some envious, and others simply curious. Richard adjusted his tie and prepared to head into a nearby hotel for an important meeting, but before he could take another step, something unusual caught his eye. On the side of the street, among the noise and the crowd, stood a boy. He couldn't have been older than 14. His clothes were simple, an old t-shirt and shorts with patches, sewn carefully in different places. His shoes were worn thin, almost falling apart. But the way he stood was anything but weak. His posture was straight, his head held high, and in his hands, he clutched a small, battered notebook filled with scribbles and folded pages. What struck Richard most wasn't the boy's appearance, it was his eyes. They held a fire, a strange confidence, as if he carried a secret the world hadn't yet discovered. Curiosity got the better of Richard. He rarely spoke to strangers on the street, but something about this boy pulled him in. With a half smile and a hint of amusement, he walked over. "What are you doing out here, kid?" Richard asked, his deep voice carrying both authority and a touch of arrogance. The boy looked up, meeting Richard's gaze without flinching. Most children his age would have looked away, intimidated by the presence of such a wealthy man. But this boy didn't. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and smiled, his eyes shining with quiet pride. "I speak 9 languages," he said firmly. Richard blinked, taken aback for a moment. Then before he could stop himself, he laughed, a loud, dismissive laugh. "9 languages? You, at your age? That's impossible!" The boy didn't flinch. He didn't shrink back or look embarrassed. He just stood there, gripping his notebook tightly, his gaze locked on Richard's face. That unshakable confidence made Richard pause. He studied the boy more closely now. His skin glistened with sweat under the harsh sun, and his clothes were clearly hand-me-downs, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of an ordinary child. They carried the weight of struggle, the hunger of ambition, and the strength of someone who had already fought many battles in life. Richard's laughter faded into a faint chuckle. He tilted his head, intrigued. 9 languages, huh? "And where did you learn them, kid? From the streets?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. The boy's lips curved into a confident grin. "Yes, from the streets, from books, from people who didn't even know I was listening." The answer stunned Richard for a moment. He hadn't expected the boy to reply so boldly, let alone with such clarity. Behind them, the noise of the city carried on. Vendors calling out prices, motorbikes zipping through narrow gaps, children chasing one another. But in that moment, it felt as though the world had gone quiet, leaving only Richard and the boy standing face to face. Something inside Richard stirred. He wasn't sure what it was, curiosity, admiration, or perhaps a faint sting of guilt. He had worked hard to build his empire, yes, but he had also been given opportunities, access to education and mentors who guided him. Could it really be possible that this boy, standing barefoot on a hot street, had taught himself 9 languages? It sounded ridiculous. It sounded unbelievable. And yet the fire in the boy's eyes made it impossible to dismiss. Richard folded his arms and narrowed his eyes slightly, studying him. "All right then," he said slowly, his tone a mix of skepticism and interest. "If you really speak 9 languages, prove it." The boy didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, as if he had been waiting for this challenge all along. He took a small step forward, clutching his notebook against his chest, and prepared to show the man before him and the world that his words weren't empty. And at that exact moment, Richard realized something. This wasn't going to be an ordinary encounter. The boy's story. The boy introduced himself, his voice steady despite the crowd beginning to take notice. "My name is Emmanuel," he said. "I come from a very poor family. My father left when I was very young, and my mother works all day just to put food on the table. But even as a child, I knew I was meant for something greater." Richard raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure what to make of this boy yet. Emmanuel didn't look extraordinary. His clothes were worn, his shoes were barely holding together, and he looked like any other child on the street. But there was something in the way he spoke, calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed, like someone who had practiced telling his story many times before. Emmanuel reached into his hands and lifted his old notebook. Its cover was peeling, its corners were bent, and the pages looked fragile, some almost ready to tear. But to him, this notebook was treasure. He opened it carefully, revealing line after line of strange symbols, scribbled words, and phrases written in different alphabets. I couldn't afford to go to school every day, he continued. Some days I would go and some days I would have to work, selling small things on the street so my mother and I could eat. But I never stopped learning. Every time tourists came to our city, I listened. When they spoke to each other, I copied their words. When they laughed, I repeated their phrases in my head. At night, I would practice what I heard, whispering to myself until I could say it perfectly. His fingers brushed over the pages like they were sacred. That's how I learned. First, I picked up French because so many visitors spoke it, then Spanish, then Arabic. The more I listened, the more I wrote, and the more I wrote, the more I remembered. And now, he looked up, his eyes gleaming. I can speak 9 languages. The confidence in his tone was unshakable, but Richard wasn't convinced. He chuckled, shaking his head slightly. 9 languages? At your age? That's a big claim, Emmanuel. He crossed his arms, leaning back on his heels. All right then. If you really speak 9 languages, prove it. The boy didn't hesitate for a second. He closed his notebook, pressed it against his chest, and stepped forward. He started with English, greeting Richard with flawless pronunciation. Good afternoon, sir. It's an honor to meet you. His words were smooth, his tone formal, almost like a young diplomat. Then, without pause, his voice shifted effortlessly into French. Bonjour, monsieur. Comment allez-vous aujourd'hui? I translated as, Good morning, hello, sir. How are you today? His accent was sharp, clear, and undeniably authentic. The small crowd that had begun forming around them stirred, exchanging surprised glances. Some people nodded, impressed, while others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Before the murmur could grow, Emmanuel's voice switched again, this time to Spanish. Buenas tardes, señor. Es un placer hablar con usted. Translated as, Good afternoon, sir. It's a pleasure to speak with you. The words flowed naturally, his tongue rolling with perfect rhythm. Richard's smile, once amused, started to fade. His eyes narrowed, watching closely. But Emmanuel wasn't done. He moved on to German. Guten Tag, mein Herr. Ich freue mich, Sie kennenzulernen. His pronunciation carried the firmness of someone who had practiced every syllable. Then Italian. Buon pomeriggio, signore. È un grande onore parlare con lei. His voice softened, musical and warm. The crowd had grown larger now, encircling them in silence. Street vendors had stopped shouting. Taxi drivers leaned out of their windows, and children tugged at their parents' hands to come closer. But Emmanuel continued, his voice unwavering. In Portuguese, he spoke fluently, each word crisp and precise. Then came Arabic, flowing, strong, and beautifully recited, as though he had been raised in the language. His words drew audible gasps from a few listeners who understood. Still not finished, Emmanuel shifted to Chinese. The tones, though challenging for most, rolled off his tongue with impressive accuracy. Ni hao, 很高兴见到你, he said, bowing slightly as some of the onlookers clapped. Finally, he ended with Russian, his words deep and powerful. Добрый день, sir. Я очень рад встретиться с вами. When he finished, the street erupted into whispers, applause, and astonished gasps. Strangers looked at one another, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some clapped, others just stared, wide-eyed. And Richard, who only minutes earlier had laughed at the boy, stood frozen, his smile gone completely. The skepticism on his face had been replaced by something else entirely, pure astonishment. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. This wasn't a trick, and it wasn't luck. The boy had switched seamlessly between 9 different languages, his accents nearly flawless in every one. For the first time in years, Richard found himself at a loss for words. He had spent his life building companies, making money and traveling across the world. He had met countless educated people, professors and interpreters. But never in his life had he met a child from the streets who carried such extraordinary talent within him. As the crowd cheered and clapped for Emmanuel, Richard stared at the boy, his mind racing. Who was this child? And what kind of future could he have if someone gave him the chance? At that moment, Richard realized something powerful. What stood before him was not just a poor boy with a notebook, but a hidden genius who had taught himself what many universities couldn't teach in years: the Millionaire's Challenge. Richard stood there, still replaying Emmanuel's words in his mind. 9 languages, spoken with such fluency that even native speakers in the crowd nodded in astonishment. For a moment, Richard almost forgot he was in the middle of a busy street, with dozens of eyes now fixed on him and the boy. But as a seasoned businessman, Richard knew one thing: raw talent, no matter how impressive, was not enough on its own. Talent could dazzle people for a moment, but without direction, without opportunity, it often faded into nothing. He folded his arms, his expression tightening into something more serious. "All right, Emmanuel," Richard said, his tone calm but firm. "You're talented. Very talented. But let me tell you something. Talent without opportunity is like a bird with broken wings. It can dream of flying, but it will never leave the ground. Tell me." He leaned down slightly so his eyes were level with the boy's. "Do you know what business is? Do you know how to make money?" Emmanuel blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. He shook his head honestly. "No, sir," he admitted, his voice steady. "I don't know how to make money." The crowd chuckled softly, some amused at the boy's frankness. But then Emmanuel added, "But I am willing to learn. I am willing to work hard. I can do anything if someone is willing to teach me." Richard raised an eyebrow. Most children his age would have been intimidated. But this boy stood his ground. His words carried weight, not desperation, but determination. The millionaire tilted his head, intrigued. A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave the boy on the street and continue with his day. After all, he had a business meeting to attend. But another part of him, the part that admired boldness, wanted to see how far this boy's courage and talent could truly take him. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Emmanuel could hear. "Then come with me," he said. "Leave this street. Show me how determined you really are." The boy's eyes widened. He glanced at the notebook in his hand, at the cracked pavement under his feet, at the vendors he had known all his life. The street was his world. It was where he learned, where he survived, where he built himself piece by piece. To leave it behind was not a small decision. For a few long seconds, Emmanuel hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest. He thought of his mother, working tirelessly so he could eat. He thought of the nights he stayed awake under dim candlelight, scribbling foreign words into his notebook while hunger gnawed at his stomach. He thought of the laughter, the doubt, the voices that told him he would never amount to anything. And then he thought of this moment. A chance, a real chance, to step into a world far bigger than the dusty streets he knew. The fire in his eyes burned brighter. He took a deep breath, straightened his back, and nodded firmly. "I'll come," he said. Richard studied him for a moment longer, searching for any sign of fear or uncertainty, but all he saw was determination, raw and unshakable. "Good," Richard said finally, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Then today your life begins to change." The crowd, who had been silently observing, erupted into whispers. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others murmured words of encouragement. To them, it looked like a miracle. One moment, Emmanuel was just another boy from the streets, and the next he had been offered an opportunity that most could only dream of. Emmanuel clutched his notebook tighter, as if it were the only piece of his old life he could carry forward. He didn't know what awaited him. He didn't know if this man was testing him, or if this was truly the beginning of something new. But one thing was clear: he couldn't let fear hold him back. As he followed Richard toward the sleek black car parked at the curb, Emmanuel felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, nervousness, and an overwhelming sense that his decision, made in those few seconds, would shape the rest of his life. He glanced back one last time at the street. The fruit vendors calling out their prices, the children laughing as they ran barefoot, the familiar chaos of the place he had called home. A lump formed in his throat, but he turned back quickly, because from this moment on, he wasn't just Emmanuel, the street boy who spoke 9 languages. He was Emmanuel, the boy who dared to take a leap into the unknown. And though neither he nor Richard could see the future, both of them knew one thing for certain: this decision would change his life forever. The test of knowledge. Richard kept his word. That very evening, he took Emmanuel into the heart of his empire, a towering glass building that gleamed against the city skyline. It was the headquarters of his multinational firm, a company that dealt with clients from every corner of the world. For Emmanuel, stepping inside was like walking into another universe. The polished marble floors reflected the golden glow of the chandeliers above. Men and women in sharp suits walked briskly, clutching tablets and documents, their eyes glued to glowing screens. The boy who had once learned languages on the streets now stood in the very place where those languages were currency. Richard led him up to a private office. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll see what you're truly capable of." That night, Emmanuel barely slept. He stared at the city lights outside his window, his notebook clutched in his hands. Fear tried to whisper in his ear, "What if I fail? What if I don't belong here?" But stronger than fear was his determination. He whispered to himself in the languages he knew, reminding himself of how far he had come. The next morning came quickly. Richard greeted him with his usual calm authority, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. He had prepared a test, one that would either expose Emmanuel's bold claims as mere tricks or confirm that the boy was indeed extraordinary. "Today," Richard announced, "you will assist our translators during a very important call. We'll be speaking with partners from different countries: France, Spain, Germany, China, and the Middle East. If you're truly as skilled as you say, you'll prove it here, in front of my entire team." The boardroom filled with executives, men and women with years of education and experience. They glanced at Emmanuel skeptically, whispering to each other. To them, he was just a street kid plucked from the roadside, and the idea that he could contribute in a professional setting was laughable. Emmanuel, however, stood tall. He wore the same patched clothes from the street, but his eyes burned with quiet resolve. The call began. Voices from different countries echoed through the speakers, each speaking rapidly in their native tongue. The company's translators leaned in, ready to do their jobs. Then Emmanuel spoke. At first it was French, smooth, natural, respectful. He listened carefully and then translated perfectly, his words flowing with ease. The executives exchanged surprised looks. Then came Spanish, quick, sharp exchanges between partners. Emmanuel's responses were immediate, confident, and fluent. The room grew quieter. When German words filled the air, Emmanuel didn't stumble. He captured every nuance, every detail, relaying the conversation as though he had been raised with it. By the time Chinese tones rang out, people were leaning forward in their seats, disbelief etched on their faces. Emmanuel navigated the complex sounds with precision, his voice calm and controlled. Even the professional translators sitting beside him couldn't hide their astonishment. And then Arabic, the words rolled off his tongue powerfully, his pronunciation so clear that the partners on the other end of the call paused for a moment, asking if he had lived in their country before. Silence fell over the boardroom. The boy who had once scribbled words into a tattered notebook on the streets was now effortlessly bridging conversations between nations, ensuring every word was understood perfectly. When the call ended, the room remained still for several moments. The executives looked at one another, as if silently confirming what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others simply stared at Emmanuel as though they had seen a miracle. Richard, seated at the head of the table, leaned back in his chair. His laughter from the street, when Emmanuel had first claimed to speak 9 languages, now seemed foolish. What stood before him was not a boy with an exaggeration, but a genius forged by hardship and persistence. A slow smile spread across Richard's face. He clapped his hands once, the sound echoing through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice firm, "I believe we have just witnessed something extraordinary." The executives broke into applause, some reluctantly, others genuinely impressed. Emmanuel lowered his head slightly, humbled, though his heart raced with pride. Later, in the quiet of his office, Richard called Emmanuel inside. The boy entered nervously, notebook still in hand. "Sit down, son," Richard said warmly. For the first time, there was no trace of skepticism in his voice. "You shocked me today." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Do you know what you proved?" Emmanuel shook his head softly. "You proved," Richard continued, "that greatness doesn't come from wealth, or privilege, or where you are born. Greatness comes from determination, discipline, and the courage to never stop learning." You, Emmanuel, are living proof of that. Emmanuel's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. For years, he had fought to prove he wasn't just another boy from the streets, and now someone finally saw him for who he was. Richard smiled gently. And this is just the beginning. Emmanuel clutched his notebook, tears glistening in his eyes, knowing that his life was no longer bound by the limits of the streets. The world had just opened its doors to him. The transformation. Richard had made many investments in his life, stocks, companies, properties, but the decision to invest in Emmanuel's future became the most valuable of them all. He didn't just give the boy money. He gave him access. Richard enrolled Emmanuel in one of the finest schools in the country, a place where the children of ministers, CEOs, and diplomats studied. At first, Emmanuel felt out of place. His patched clothes, his modest manners, and his background marked him as different. Some students whispered about him, doubting whether he belonged there. But Emmanuel wasn't a boy who broke under pressure. Every whisper, every doubtful glance only pushed him harder. He studied late into the night, still scribbling in his old notebook, which he kept as a reminder of where he came from. With the tutors Richard provided, he refined his pronunciation, learned advanced grammar, and picked up even more languages. His gift, once raw and unpolished, began to shine like a diamond under careful hands. Richard also ensured that Emmanuel saw the world. He sent him abroad for short trips, encouraging him to experience the cultures he had once only studied. In Paris, Emmanuel spoke fluently with locals who couldn't believe the accent of the young African boy. In Madrid, he helped tourists find their way, shocking them with his fluency in Spanish. In Beijing, he bowed respectfully, conversing with elders who marveled at his tones. And in the Middle East, his Arabic allowed him to form deep connections, earning trust instantly. Each journey strengthened him, not only in language but also in confidence. He realized that words were not just tools of communication. They were bridges that connected people who otherwise might never understand one another. Years passed. The boy who once stood on the streets with a tattered notebook was no longer just Emmanuel the street child. He was Emmanuel, the global ambassador, the cultural bridge, the voice of unity. He worked with international organizations, sitting at round tables with leaders and diplomats. Where others saw barriers, differences in culture, misunderstandings in speech, Emmanuel saw opportunities. His translations carried not just words, but respect, tone, and empathy. Nations that often clashed found common ground when he spoke, because he didn't just translate language. He translated meaning. Journalists from around the world began to seek him out. His story was one of hope, grit, and transformation. In one famous interview, a journalist leaned forward and asked him the question everyone wanted to know. Emmanuel, what inspired you to learn 9 languages when you had nothing? What gave you the strength to keep going? Emmanuel smiled, his voice steady and filled with the same pride he once carried as a boy on the street. Because I believed, he said slowly, that my tongue could be stronger than money. Languages are bridges, and I wanted to build bridges where walls existed. I didn't want to be a prisoner of my circumstances. I wanted to prove that knowledge can break chains, that words can open doors even when pockets are empty. His words struck deeply, echoing across television screens, printed pages, and online articles. People who once thought of poverty as a life sentence now began to see it differently. Emmanuel had become living proof that hardship could forge greatness. And as for Richard, he never forgot that hot afternoon when he had laughed at a boy. For years afterward, whenever he spoke at conferences or to young entrepreneurs, he often shared the story. I laughed at him, Richard would say, his voice tinged with humility. I thought his claim was ridiculous. A boy from the street saying he could speak 9 languages? But that same boy taught me one of the greatest lessons of my life. Never underestimate someone because of where they come from. Sometimes the brightest diamonds are found in the roughest stones. Emmanuel was that diamond. In time, Emmanuel became more than an ambassador. He became a symbol of possibility. Schools invited him to speak to children. Charities used his story as inspiration, and families who once told their kids, "You can't dream that big," now pointed to Emmanuel and said, "Yes, you can." And through it all, Emmanuel never forgot his roots. He often returned to the very streets where he once stood, helping children like himself, handing out books, and telling them, inside you, there is greatness waiting to be discovered. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. The transformation was complete. The boy with nothing had become a man with everything, not just wealth or success, but purpose. And it all began with a single declaration. On a dusty street, I speak 9 languages. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next inspiring tale.